Salim Dhar is the world's most wanted terrorist. The CIA is under pressure to hunt him down after he narrowly failed to kill the US president. The borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan are the target of relentless drone strikes, but no one can find him. As Britain braces itself for an airborne terrorist attack, Daniel Marchant finds himself in a race against time to stop Dhar and prevent huge civilian casualties. The author opens the book with the following quote.
"For while the treason I detest, the traitor still I love." John Hoole.
And now, games traitors play.
Chapter 1. A hot afternoon in Marrakech, and the square was already full of people and promise. If the storyteller was aware of the crowd around him, he didn't show it. The old man sipped at his sweet mint tea and sat down on a plastic chair, first brushing something off it with his empty hand. Had he looked up, he would have seen men and women surge across the square like iron filings drawn by the magnetism of his act. But he never raised his head, not until he was ready to begin his tale. Daniel Marchant wondered if he prayed in these moments, or was just running a mental finger over the bookshelves, choosing his narrative. He had been watching this particular storyteller, or halakha, for a week now, convinced that he held the answer to a question that had occupied every waking hour and all of his dreams since he had arrived in Morocco 3 months earlier. From his vantage point on the rooftop terrace of the Café Argana, Marchant was able to watch the half-dozen halakas who worked the northern end of Jamar el-Fanar Square. None of the others drew a crowd like this one, with his cobalt-blue turban, untidy teeth, and cheap pebble glasses that magnified his eyes. Locals came for the stories, tourists for the photos, unable to understand a word, but swept along by the drama. This halakha could tell 1,001 different tales of dervishes and jinns, each one recounted as if, like Queen Shahrazad, his own life depended on it. Marchant had learned that storytelling had been in his Berber family for centuries, passed down from father to son. In his hands, the tradition was safe, despite the rival temptations of Egyptian television soap operas. And he knew just when to pause, leaving his story on a knife edge. Only when the money bowl had been passed around would he continue. On a good day, he was even more of a draw than the Nawa musicians from the Sahara who somersaulted and swirled their way through the crowds down by the smoky food stalls. When he was talking, the square's snake charmers rested their cobras, fire-eaters paused for breath, even the travelling dentists put down their dentures and tools. Marchant sat up in his chair, sensing that the time had almost come. He wasn't sure how the halakha judged when the crowd had reached critical mass. The man was a natural showman, milking the moment every afternoon when he finally lifted his sun-beaten face and surveyed his audience with a defiant stare. Marchant reached for his camera, focusing the lens on the top of the man's turban. The storyteller's head was still bent forward, concealing his face. The lens was not the sort that could be bought in a camera shop, but anyone watching Marchant would not have suspected that it was many times more powerful than its innocuous length suggested. He appeared just like another tourist as he slid it through the ornate metal latticework of the restaurant railing and observed the scene below him. Except that a tourist might have taken a few photos, particularly when the halakha finally looked up to address his expectant crowd. But Marchant forgot he was watching through a camera, forgot his cover. He could see that the man in his lens was frightened. Marchant had come to know the halakha's assured mannerisms, the tricks of his trade. The street wisdom of yesterday had vanished, his stage presence replaced by fear. He should have been staring ahead, hypnotizing his audience with a narrator's spell. But instead, the man's eyes flitted to the back of the crowd, as if he were searching for someone. Pulling on the hem of his grey jalaba, the local head-to-toe garment, he rocked on his battered babouche slippers, shifting his weight from heel to toe. For perhaps the first time in his life, the storyteller appeared lost for words. Marchant checked with his own eyes, as if the camera might be lying, and then looked again through the lens. He took some photos, cursing himself for his slackness, and scanned the back of the crowd. The man was here somewhere, he was sure of it, waiting to hear the halakha's coded phrases that would send him off into the snow-tipped Atlas Mountains to the south of the city. And Marchant would follow, wherever the man went, however remote, knowing who the message was for. For several weeks, Marchant had been convinced that someone was planning to make contact with Salim Dhar through the storytellers of Marrakech. He had overheard something in the souks, a fleeting remark in amongst the chatter. Using the halakas was a primitive form of communication for the world's most wanted terrorist. But that was the point. Echelon, the West's intelligence analysis network, was in meltdown, monitoring every email, phone call, text and Twitter for the faintest trace of Dhar. It had been ever since he tried to assassinate the US president in Delhi the previous year. Every time the analysts at Fort Meade in Maryland thought they had found him, the information was relayed to the CIA's headquarters in Langley. Its drone strikes in Afpak, where most of the sightings were reported, were now running at 30 a month. But Dhar was still free, on the run, and Marchant was certain that no amount of software would ever find him. Dhar was shunning technology, keeping one step ahead of the modern world by retreating into the old. Ancient oral traditions, such as the halakas, were beyond the range of the spy planes and stealth satellites that orbited the globe in ever more desperate circles. It had worked for fugitives before. During the 1970s, when General Alfkir was Morocco's hardline interior minister, the halakas used code words to refer to him and alert the public to planned raids by his secret police. Snakes were more than serpents sliding through the narrative. They were warnings of time and place. It was a way of communicating without suspicion. Information could be passed anonymously, without one-to-one meetings. Textbook tradecraft. And now, the halakha was about to issue another message. Marchant pushed his tea away, folded some dirhams under the silver pot, and went to the stairwell. He knew he didn't have long. Down in the square, a man approached him from a narrow alley to one side of the cafe. "Hashish? You want some hashish?" Marchant managed a smile. His student cover must have been convincing. Officially, he was in Morocco for a PhD on Berber culture and took his studies very seriously. His dirt-blonde hair was cut short, and he was wearing a woolen jalaba. "Thanks, no," he said, walking on towards the crowd. "Suktor, leather, instruments? I show you Led Zeppelin photos. Mr. Robert, he came to my friend's shop." Marchant ignored him and walked on. He could do without the attention. The tout was not giving up, though, trotting along beside him, pouring out a list of random words that he must have gleaned over the years, like a magpie from visiting tourists. "Which place are you from, Berberman? London? I know UK. Yorkshire pudding, 73 bus, Sheffield steel." But the tout was losing interest. He peeled away, calling half-heartedly after Marchant, "M&S? A303? Marchant had almost joined the crowd now. He didn't want any trouble in future from this man, so he raised a hand in a friendly farewell, his back to him. "Terrorist!" the tout said, loud enough for one or two people at the edge of the crowd to turn around. Marchant had been called a few things in Marrakech, but this was a first. The choice of that term of abuse was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence, he told himself, but he scanned the square again. Most of the sellers had got to know him in the past few months, letting the diligent British student practice his Berber on them. This tout was new to the area. Marchant threw him another glance. He was now leading 2 female tourists into the Medina, looking at their map. Was it a CIA cover? Did someone else share his suspicions of the halakha? The Americans had kept an eye on Marchant when he had first arrived in Marrakech, but they had soon lost interest, believing that the British agent was barking up the wrong tree. Langley was sure that Salim Dhar wasn't in North Africa, but had headed north after attempting to assassinate the president, smuggling himself across the Kashmir border in a goods lorry. The trail had gone cold in Pakistan, as it so often did, and they assumed he was now hiding on the northwest border with Afghanistan, along with many of America's other most wanteds. Marchant joined the back of the crowd and listened, watching the people around him. They had already fallen under the spell of the halakha, who had regained his composure. As he listened to the story of Sinbad the sailor, Marchant wished his Berber was better. He was back, lying on the floor of his childhood home in the Cotswolds. A recording of Sinbad was the very first vinyl album his father had ever bought him. For weeks after playing it on the big old wooden-cased HMV player, Marchant had had nightmares about the rock bird, terrified that the skies would darken with its enormous wings. The halakha had paused. Marchant watched him closely, the droplets of sweat beading his brow. He had caught the eye of someone near the back of the crowd. Holding his gaze for barely a second, Marchant had clocked the man earlier, a Berber, early 20s, calico skullcap. Marchant waited for the halakha to begin speaking again, of giant serpents and the rockbird, and then glanced back at the man. But he was already gone, walking briskly across the square, trying not to break into a run. Chapter 2. The 6 US Marines had been travelling all night, and most of the day, bound, gagged, and blindfolded. But now the 4x4 had come to a stop, giving their bruised bodies a brief respite. The vehicle's suspension was shot through, and they had been driven over poor mountainous tracks. No one, though, was under any illusion about what lay ahead. If they had reached the end of their journey, they were close to the end of their lives. They had expected to die the night before, when a group of Taliban insurgents had ambushed their radio reconnaissance unit on a notorious stretch of road near Gaian in Paktika, eastern Afghanistan. They should have been in Helmand with the rest of their Marine Expeditionary Force, but had been seconded to Paktika in a push to hunt down the local Pashtun warlord, Sirajuddin Haqqani. After a standoff, waiting in vain for the air support they had called in, the Marines had stepped out from behind their disabled Hummer, with their arms up, exhausted, expecting to be shot. But the Taliban had taken them prisoner. It was a high-risk strategy. The US response would be on an overwhelming scale. The AC-130 gunships, though, never showed, and the Taliban moved out quickly with their captives. The rear and side doors of the 4x4 opened, and 2 Taliban began to pull the Marines from the vehicle, grabbing the collars of their sweat-soaked fatigues. As their platoon commander, Lieutenant Randall Oakes knew he had to be strong, set an example for the others. But in truth, he wished he had been shot the previous night. He thought of the videos of beheadings he had told himself not to watch before coming out to Afghanistan, the stories that had circulated in the camp when they had first flown in from North Carolina. It wasn't good to be a prisoner of the Taliban. Oakes could tell through his blindfold that the daylight was dying. It was cooler, too, compared to Gaian, where they had been ambushed, and he had been aware of gaining height during the long drive. If they were being taken to the mountains, maybe they could hope to live for a few more days. They would become bargaining chips, a way to buy some advantage in a war that neither side was ever going to win. But now he sensed another agenda. None of their Taliban captors said anything as they pushed the Marines along a track. Oakes could hear the others stumbling like him on the rocky terrain, But there was one noise that was different. The Taliban were dragging someone along, a Marine who was too weak to walk. Oakes knew it was Lance Corporal Troy Murray. They were a tight-knit unit, had been ever since they had arrived 5 months earlier, but Murray had stood out for all the wrong reasons from the start. It wasn't just the word infidel that he had tattooed in big letters across his chest. He was physically the weakest and mentally a mess, unable to go out on patrol unless he had taken too many psychological meds. This was his 4th tour, and he should never have been sent. 1 more month, and they were due to return to Camp Lejeune. Their family's banners would soon be up on the fencing that ran along Route 24 outside the base, joining the mile upon mile of missed you and welcome home messages that had become a part of the North Carolina landscape. It was a public patchwork of loss, each banner telling a private story of missed births, heartache, lonely nights, enforced chastity. Oakes remembered the first time he saw them, returning from his inaugural tour of Iraq. Envious cheers had gone up on the bus when Murray, in happier days, had seen his. Get ready for a long debriefing, stud muffin. And then he had seen his own, written in bright purple felt tip on a big bedsheet near the main gate. Welcome home, Lieutenant Daddy. Just in time for the terrible twos. He was a family man now. In recent days, the platoon had begun to brag about what they would do when they got home. Visit the clubs in Wilmington, the whiskey, the rocks, shoot the breeze on Onslow Beach, listen out for the bell of the man selling snowballs. But there was only one thing now on Oakes's list: to become a more loving husband, a less absent father. He would attend church every Sunday, every day if necessary. As an adult, he had never been religious, but in the past 24 hours he had prayed with a desperate intensity, trying in vain to remember the brief period in his childhood when he had fallen asleep in prayer, risen early to read the Bible at the kitchen table. Within the last hour, as his own elusive faith had slipped through his hands like desert sand, he had even attempted to address other people's gods too, explaining, apologizing, beseeching. The group was being herded into what felt like a small farm outbuilding. The few outdoor sounds, faint wind, distant bird song, were partly muffled, but not entirely. It was as if they were surrounded by walls, but were still outside. Above their heads, Oak thought he could hear the sound of a canopy flapping. Before he could think any more about their location, he was pushed down onto the dry floor, his back up against an uneven wall. The gag in his mouth was peeled up, and a bottle of water put to his chafed lips. He drank deeply, until the bottle was pulled away, his gag replaced. It was not as tight as it had been, though, and Oakes began at once to work his jaw, keeping it moving. The removal of his sight had heightened his other senses. He knew there were 2 Taliban with them. One was administering the water, but what was the other doing? He listened above the delirious moaning of Murray, who sounded barely conscious. There was the click of a case, and the sound of something metallic being placed high up on a wall, on a windowsill perhaps. Was it an improvised explosive device, set to be triggered by their movement? There was silence again. The 2 Taliban were leaving them. There were more muffled moans from the men, sounds of primitive despair as they dug their boots heel-deep into the mud. Oakes heard the 4x4 start up outside. He was expecting some wheel spin, a triumphant circling of the prisoners before it roared off. But the vehicle just drove back down the track, as casually as his father's station wagon when he used to leave for work, until the sound of its engine was lost in the stillness of the night. That slowness terrified him. It was too calm, too rehearsed, indicative of a bigger plan. 10, maybe 15 minutes later, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of someone speaking Urdu, coming from close by. Oakes's tired brain struggled to work out what was happening. whether he was hallucinating. He tried to focus on the name the man had given when he first spoke. It hung in the air above them like a paper kite, nagging at Oakes's mind as it bobbed in the evening breeze. Salim. Chapter 3. This was the moment Omar Rashid had been trained for, but he had never actually expected it to happen. Not to him. But there it was, an unambiguous flashing light on his console. He knew his life would never be the same again. He was just a junior analyst on the SIGINT graveyard shift, always had been, ever since he'd signed up to the National Security Agency at Fort Meade in Maryland. And that was exactly how he liked it. Success happened to the ambitious, to the hungry. Rashid was more than happy to draw his modest salary and listen through the night to the regional traffic, before heading home to his basement apartment in Baltimore. He enjoyed his work, but it wasn't loyalty to the NSA that drove him. A few hours earlier, he had tuned into a pro-Western Pakistani politician and his wife arguing on a phone in Lahore. Later, when the husband had returned to his home in a wealthy suburb, he had listened to them making love, too, thanks to a wire installed in the bedroom by the ISI, Pakistan's main intelligence agency. The ISI was unaware that its heavily encrypted surveillance frequencies had been breached, but Rashid didn't concern himself about that. Just as he tried not to dwell on the pleasure he derived from such interceptions, known as vinegar strokes among the night shift analysts. He had feigned indifference when he handed in his transcript to the line manager, but it was a gift, and he hoped she would enjoy it later. Didn't everyone at SIGINT City? This, though, was different. The flashing light was an Echelon Level 5 alert, triggered by a keyword integral to one of Fort Meade's biggest ever manhunts. Rashid's able mind worked fast. Despite Echelon's best efforts, it was impossible for the West to monitor more than a fraction of the world's phone calls and emails in real time. Most of the daily take was recorded and crunched later by NSA's data miners, who drilled down through the traffic, searching for suspicious patterns. They worked out in Utah, where a vast data silo had been built in the desert. Rashid was one of a handful of Urdu analysts who worked in the now. He cast his net each day on the AFPAC waters and waited. Real-time analysts knew where to listen, but the odds of catching anyone were still stacked against them. As a result, Rashid was left alone. Anything he could bring to the table was a bonus. But if this latest intercept was what the flashing light suggested it was, he would be fated, hailed as a hero. His work would suddenly be the center of attention. A manager would study his previous reports, discover a pattern, the unnaturally high number of bedroom intercepts. Someone would sniff the vinegar. The keyword and a set of coordinates in North Waziristan were triggering alarms all over the system. Rashid adjusted his headphones. He was listening to one half of a mobile phone conversation in Urdu. The other person must have been speaking on an encrypted handset. Comment would track it down later, unpick its rudimentary ciphers. The voice-print recognition software had already kicked in, analysing the speaker's vocal cavities and articulator patterns, the interplay of lips, teeth and tongue. Rashid didn't need a computer to tell him whose voice it was. The whole of Fort Meade knew it. It had been played over the building's intercom in the months after the attempt on the president's life. Photos of the would-be assassin were on every notice board, along with the details of the bonus for any employee who helped bring about his capture. In a few seconds, Rashid would have details of the mobile number's provenance and history. Occasionally this yielded something, but 99 times out of 100, it was a clean pay-as-you-go phone, brought over the counter in a backstreet booth in Karachi. Rashid's supervisor arrived at his shoulder, just as the screen started to blink. "You got something for me, Omar?" she said, more in hope than expectation. Rashid nodded at his computer, feeling his mouth go dry. 2 lights were now flashing. The number had been used once before, in South India, days before the assassination attempt on the president in Delhi. It was the last time Salim Dhar had made a call on a mobile phone. "Sweet holy mother of Jesus, you've been fishing," the supervisor whispered, one hand on his shoulder. With the other, she picked up Rashid's phone, still staring at his screen. "Get me James Spiral at Langley. Tell him it's a real-time level 5. Chapter 4. Marchant had nearly lost the man several times in the network of narrow lanes off Jamar el-Fanar. He appeared to be heading south, walking fast down the Rue de Bab Agnau, occasionally looking behind him, but only at junctions where he could pass off the glances as normal behaviour. The man knew what he was doing. Marchant kept as much distance as he dared between them, but he was on his own. In normal circumstances, a surveillance team of 6 would be moving through the streets with him, ahead of and behind the target, like an invisible cocoon, covering every possibility. Marchant had no such luxury. He kept one eye out for a taxi as the street widened. It was a less popular part of town for foreigners, and he needed to work harder to blend in. Instead of shoe shops selling yellow babouche and stalls piled high with pyramids of dates and almonds, there were noisy industrial units, larger and less welcoming than the tourist-friendly workshops in the Medina. Marchant would follow the man like for like. It helped the pursuer to think like his target, to try to anticipate his choices. If he had a car parked somewhere, Marchant would find a car. If he got onto a bicycle, Marchant would find a bicycle. The man had stopped outside what seemed to be a small carpet factory. Marchant hung back in the shadow of an empty doorway 50 yards down the street. He could hear the sound of looms weaving, shuttles shooting, bundles of wool hung from an upstairs window, the rich, cupreous dyes drying in the low sun. A woman came to the factory entrance. She chatted briefly with the man, looking up and down the street as she spoke, and pressed a key into his hand. Without hesitating, the man walked around the corner, started up an old motorized bike and drove off slowly, blue smoke belching from the 2-stroke engine. For a moment, Marchant wondered if it would be easier to pursue him on foot, but he checked himself. Like for like. Despite being in a hurry, the man had specifically chosen low-key transport. He was trying not to draw attention to himself, which suggested he was worried about being followed or watched. Marchant crossed the road to a row of parked mopeds. Marrakech was overrun with mobilettes and other Parisian-style motorized bikes, a legacy of when Morocco was a French protectorate. They weaved in and out of the tourists and shoppers in the souks, taking priority like the cows in the markets of Old Delhi, which he used to visit on his ayah's shoulders as a child. He glanced at the selection. There was an old blue Motorbicane 50V mobilette, top speed 30 miles per hour, and a couple of more modern Peugeot Vogues. The mobilette was slower, but it would be easier to start, and the man was already out of sight, the noise of his engine fading fast. It also held a certain appeal for Marchant. For years the mobilette was made under license in India. A few months before his father finished his second posting in Delhi, the family had presented Chandar, their cook, with one to replace his old Hero bicycle. Chandar used to maintain it lovingly, showing Marchant, then 8 years old, how to start it. Both of them laughing as Chandar pedalled furiously in his chef's whites until the engine coughed into life. Marchant checked that the mobilette's wheel forks weren't locked. Nothing he had done since his arrival in Marrakech had aroused any attention from the authorities. That was part of the deal, one of the conditions he had agreed with MI6 in return for being sent to Morocco and allowed to operate on his own. He hadn't wanted backup or support. It was, after all, a very personal quest. Family business, as his father would have called it. Marcus Fielding, the professorial chief of MI6, had agreed, knowing that if anyone could find Salim Dhar, it was Marchant. But Fielding had warned him. No drinking, no brawls, no break-ins, nothing illegal. He had caused enough trouble already in his short career. Marchant had kept his side of the bargain. For 3 months he had stayed off the source, savouring life outside Legoland, MI6's headquarters in Vauxhall. The CIA had prevented him from leaving Britain in the aftermath of the assassination attempt, but after a frustrating year, Fielding had finally prevailed, much to Marchant's relief. London was no place for a field agent. He had studied hard in Marrakech's libraries, researching the history of the Berbers and taking the opportunity to reread the Quran. It had been required reading during his time at Fort Monkton, MI6's training base on the end of the Gospel Peninsula. But he read it now with renewed interest, searching for anything that might help him to understand Salim Dhar's world. In the cool of the early mornings, he had gone running through the deserted Medina. The first run had been the hardest, not because his body was out of shape, but because of the memories it brought back. The London Marathon, Layla, their time together. He had returned after 2 miles in need of a stiff drink, but he managed to keep his promise to Fielding. After 2 weeks, he no longer missed the Scotch. In a Muslim country, abstinence was easier than he had feared it would be, and he realised that he no longer missed Layla. It felt as if life was starting anew. In the year following Layla's death, he had been unable to go running. He had missed her every day, seen her face wherever he went in London. The coldness that had encased his heart since he arrived in Morocco had shocked him at first, but he knew it had to be if he was to survive in the service. His trained eye had spotted one suicide bomber among 35,000 participants, but he had failed to identify the traitor, running at his own side, the woman he had loved. Now, though, he was about to cross a line, and for a moment he felt the buzz he'd been missing. It was hardly a big breach, but if someone reported a foreigner stealing a mobilette, there was a small chance that the local police would become involved. A report might be filed. He would show up on the grid, however faintly, and he couldn't afford to do that. London would recall him. He would be back behind a desk in Legoland, analysing embellished CX reports from ambitious field agents, drinking too much at the Morpeth Arms after work. But he couldn't afford to lose his man. He glanced up and down the street. No one was around. He sat on the mobilette, which was still on its stand. He checked the fuel switch, then began pedalling, thinking of Chandar as he worked the choke and the compressor with his thumbs. The engine started up, and he rocked the bike forward, throttled back, and set off down the road. It wasn't exactly a wheel spin start. As the mobilette struggled to reach 25 miles per hour, the only thing on Marchant's mind was where the man could be heading on a motorised pedal bike. Marchant had assumed all along that if he was right about the halakha, the contact would carry his message south into the high Atlas Mountains to Azni, and beyond to the Tizian Test Pass, where the Moroccan Islamic Combatant Group, GICM, was known to run remote training camps. It had others in the Rif Mountains too. The GICM had its roots in the war against the former Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and had forged close ties with al-Qaeda, providing logistical support to operatives passing through Morocco. After 9/11, it had become more proactive, and a number of sleeper cells were activated. The synchronized bombings in Casablanca in 2003, which had killed 44 people, bore all the hallmarks of the GICM, and the leadership had helped with the recruitment of jihadis for the war in Iraq. Marchant was convinced after 3 months in Marrakech that the organization was now shielding Salim Dhar in the mountains. But the smoking bike ahead of him would struggle to reach the edge of town, let alone make it up the steep climb to Azni. Chapter 5. Lieutenant Oakes had worked the wet gag loose enough to speak. It was still in his mouth, but the tension had gone, and he was able to make himself heard.
"Everyone okay?"
he asked, breathing heavily. He could tell from the grunted responses that the others had been propped against the wall on either side of him, 2 to the left, 2 to the right. Only one of them hadn't replied.
"Where's Murray?"
Oakes asked. There was a faint reply from across the room. At least he was still alive. Outside, the noises of an Afghanistan night offered little comfort. The distant cries of a pack of wild dogs. The Urdu had stopped a few minutes earlier, and Oakes was now certain whose voice it had been.
"We don't have long,"
he said, edging himself across the floor to what he hoped was the centre of the hut. Movement was difficult, painful. His legs were bound tight at the ankles, and his wrists had been shackled together high up behind his back. His arms bent awkwardly. No one moved, and he wondered if any of them had understood his distorted words.
"We've got to get to the centre. Right here,"
he continued, falling on his side. He lay there for a few seconds, his cheek on the mud floor. It smelt vaguely of animals, of the stables he had visited in West Virginia for a childhood birthday. They had minutes to live, and he only had one shot at saving them.
"Get your asses over here!"
he shouted, his voice choking with the effort of trying to right himself.
"Jesus, guys! Don't you get it?"
He heard the shuffle of fatigues across the floor.
"Is that you, Jimmy? Leroy? Bunch up tight, all of you."
Slowly the Marines dragged themselves into the centre of the room, even Murray, who was the last to arrive, rolling himself over on the dry mud. He lay at Oakes's feet, listening to his leader, breathing irregularly.
"That voice,"
Oakes said, composing himself, frustrated by his distorted words. He was sounding like the deaf boy in his class at high school.
"It was Salim Dhar's."
He worked his jaw again, trying to shake off the sodden gag. No one said anything. They still hadn't realized the implications.
"A UAV will be on its way, you understand that? A drone. The fucking Reaper's coming."
Murray let out a louder moan. Oakes tried not to think about the 2 Hellfire missiles he'd once seen being loaded under an MQ-1 Predator at Balad Air Base in Iraq. The kill chain had been shortened since then. There was no longer the same delay, and the MQ-1 Predator had become the MQ-9 Reaper, a purpose-built hunter-killer with 500-pound bombs as well as Hellfires. America had learned its lessons after it had once seen Mullah Omar, the one-eyed leader of the Taliban, in the crosswires of an armed predator. It was in October 2001, a few weeks after 9/11, and the CIA had wanted to fire at Omar's convoy of 4x4s. But the decision was referred upwards to top brass in the Pentagon, who consulted lawyers and withheld the order while Omar stopped to pray at a mosque. The moment passed, and the story, true or false, entered military folklore. Americans had been trying to make amends ever since, taking out hundreds of Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets with pilotless drones or UAVs. But Oakes knew that the military had never quite got over the Omar incident. Now the Taliban was taunting them again.
"We'll show up on the UAV's thermal imaging,"
Oakes said.
"This lousy cowshed's just got a sheet for a roof."
He had little confidence in his plan, but he had to try something. He owed it to his daughter.
"Do exactly as I say, and pray to your God."
Chapter 6. Marchant knew as soon as the man pulled into the petrol station that he was going in for an upgrade. The bike had made it 5 miles out of Marrakech on the R203, across the dry plains south of the city, but it was now starting to struggle. His own mobilette was suffering too, and the frosted mountains were looming, floating on the horizon in the evening light. But it wasn't the scenery that interested Marchant. It was the group of touring motorbikes that had stopped to refuel at the station. His mind was beginning to think like a thief's. He pulled up 200 yards short of the garage, bought a bottle of mineral water from a roadside stall, and drank deeply, watching the dusty forecourt. There were at least 10 bikes, powerful tourers laden down with carriers covered in ferry stickers and English flags. Marchant knew from his 3 months in Marrakech that Morocco was a popular raid for British bikers. He had seen them rumbling into town on their way to the Atlas Mountains, where the roads were good and the passes were among the highest in Africa. The riders, bulked out in their padded leathers, had crowded around one bike. It was set apart from the others next to a support Land Rover Defender. A man was lying on the ground, beside the back wheel. The bike seemed to have a mechanical problem of some sort, and the group was deep in discussion, talking animatedly with 2 local guides. The other bikes were unattended. If the keys were in the ignition, it would be easy for the man to set off on one of them. But he drove past the bikes, past the petrol pumps, and parked his moped on the far side of the forecourt shop. He then walked around the back of the building, out of sight. What was he doing? Marchant kept watching as he slipped the lid back onto his plastic bottle of water. Moments later, the man reappeared, helmeted, and riding a powerful touring bike. As if making a token check for traffic, he looked back down the dusty road in Marchant's direction. Was he taunting him? And was gone, roaring off towards Asni and the mountains. Marchant felt sick. He was about to lose his man. He also knew that he was right, that Salim Dhar was up there somewhere in the high Atlas. And that made his stomach tighten so much that he wanted to throw up. The only good thing was that none of the bikers had clocked the man as he had driven off. In Marchant's experience, bikers usually checked out each other's hardware, but they were too preoccupied with their own broken machine. Marchant remounted his mobilette and rode up to the garage. He switched the engine off before he turned into the forecourt and freewheeled silently for the last 20 yards. He passed the first 2 bikes, checking the ignitions. Neither had a key. But the third, a BMW GS Adventure, did. Marchant parked up beyond it and glanced once in the direction of the group. It was then that he realized that the man on the ground was not trying to mend the bike. He was the focus of the group's attention, and he was lying very still. The bikers were too far away from Marchant to hear what they were saying, but he thought he heard someone mention a doctor. Ignoring an instinctive urge to go over and help, Marchant switched quickly from his moped to the tourer, turned the ignition, and felt the 1150cc engine rumble into life beneath him. Without looking up, he moved off the forecourt, joined the main road, and accelerated slowly away from the garage, heading for Mount Toubkal, the highest peak on the horizon. Chapter 7. James Spyro had not enjoyed his job with the CIA since he had been moved to head of clandestine Europe. It was a promotion, and should have been rewarding. A few comfortable years in London before he returned to Virginia for greater things. But he hadn't counted on Salim Dhar proving so elusive. Ever since he had slipped through the net in India, Dhar had been Spyro's biggest headache. He would wake at night, sheets drenched in sweat, seeing his president take the bullet that had somehow missed him in Delhi. His in-tray was full of daily requests from the Pentagon, the White House, the media, all wanting to know where Dhar was and why he hadn't been eliminated. And in his darkest moments, he couldn't stop thinking of Layla, the woman who had died instead of the president, the woman he had slept with only hours before. Spyro knew his career hung in the balance, which was why he was now back on home soil, coordinating the agency's biggest manhunt since the search for Osama bin Laden after 9/11. There had been dozens of credible sightings of Dhar around the world, each one proving false, each one ratcheting up the pressure on Spyro to find him. The collateral damage from drone strikes hadn't helped his cause. The last one in Pakistan, based on an ISI tip-off, had killed 30 civilians, mostly women and children. And what were America's greatest allies doing to help? Diddly shit. London's relationship with Dhar was delicate, according to Marcus Fielding. Dubious, more like. Daniel Marchant, the one person who might be able to find Dhar, was on vacation in North Africa, if such a thing was possible, eating too much couscous in Marrakech. If it had been up to Spyro, Marchant would have been strapped back onto the waterboard, telling them all he knew about Dhar, rather than being allowed to wander around Morocco's souks as if nothing had happened. Now, though, the end seemed finally in sight. It was always going to be a matter of time until Dhar made a mistake. "Run me those coordinates again," he said to the operator next to him. He was standing in the cockpit, a hot and crowded trailer, also known as a mobile ground control station, in a quiet corner of Creech U.S. Air Force Base, Nevada. In front of him, 2 operatives were seated in high-backed chairs, each monitoring a bank of screens. One was a pilot with 42 Attack Squadron, a seasoned officer in his 40s who used to fly F-16 fighter jets, but was now directing MQ-9 Reapers, the most advanced hunter-killer drones in the world. The other was his sensor operator, a woman no older than 25, who controlled the Reaper's multi-spectral targeting suite. Spyro had spent a lot of his time at Creech in recent weeks, too much for his liking. And he had eaten too many Taco Bells in Las Vegas, 35 miles southeast. Creech used to be a bare-bones facility, a rocky outpost in the desert, but now it resembled a building site. New hangars were going up all around the main airstrip, which had once been used for landing practice by pilots from the nearby Nellis Air Force Base. Spyro found it hard to believe that such a bleak, uninhabited place represented the future of aerial combat. But he guessed that was the point. USAF's first squadron of Reapers was unmanned. The pilot in front of him read out the coordinates. Dhar's voice had been traced to a remote location in North Waziristan, on the borders of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Fort Meade had done a good job for once. Someone had been listening in real time, and not just to Pakistani generals having sex. This was the big one, and there was a palpable sense of excitement in the cockpit, even from the base commander. He had stepped into the trailer when news spread across the base that Salim Dhar might be about to be taken down. It would be a big moment for the commander. His unit, 432 Air Expeditionary Wing, had stood up at Creech in 2007 to spearhead the global war on terror, and he needed a result. Spyro knew the commander blamed the CIA for the recent spate of bad publicity. The last strike in Pakistan had brought relations between the agency and the USAF to a new low. "I think we have our man," Spyro said, turning to the commander. "We need to do this by the book," he replied. "You know that." "Of course. The book says we take Dhar out. We have an 80% confidence threshold." "Are there any legals?" the commander asked, turning to an officer next to him. "Negative, sir. Potential for civilian collateral is 0. The building is remote. Nearest population cluster 5 miles south. And this is a level 5. "Colonel, we're locked onto the target," the pilot said, turning to the sensor operator. "Can you put a thermal up on screen 1? Spyro watched as blotches of bright colour appeared on the screen between the 2 seated operators. The surrounding screens were relaying live video streams from electro-optical and image-intensified night cameras mounted under the nose of the Reaper, and stills from a synthetic aperture radar. Spyro still hadn't quite got his head round the fact that these images were streaming live, give or take a 1 or 2 second delay, from 30,000 feet above Afghanistan, 7,500 miles away. "Fuse thermal with intensified," the pilot said. The image on the main screen sharpened a little, but it was still no more than a series of yellow, red, and purple shapes. It was at this point that the young female analyst first began to worry about their target. She wasn't meant to be on duty now. The 24/7 rota they worked to had lost its shape in the previous few hours, and she should have been back in her room, getting some sleep and reading the Bible before her next shift. A lot of the analysts headed off to Vegas after work, but she found the contrast too great. One moment looking at magnified images of a destroyed Taliban target, the next shooting craps. But the next analyst on duty had phoned in sick, and she had agreed to work on until cover showed up. That was 2 hours ago. She didn't like bending the rules. She tried to live a quiet, disciplined life. All she could hope for was that the base commander didn't glance at the rota sheet on the wall behind them. "Sir, we have a multiple personnel in the target zone," she said, looking closely at the screen. "And what looks like a pack of wild dogs 40 yards to the east." Nighttime image analysis was a skill that not everyone on the base appreciated. The pilots did, but she resented the disdain with which the CIA officers appeared to view her profession. Spyro was the worst, but that was also because he kept trying to look down her blouse. He hadn't the first idea about the subtleties of either women or her job. During the day, with clear visibility, it was easy enough to distinguish man from woman, cat from dog, even from 30,000 feet. The images were pin-sharp. But at night, you had to rely on the digitally enhanced imagery of the infrared spectrum. Interpreting the ghostly monochrome of the mid-IR wavelengths required intuition and training to flesh out the shapes. You had to impose upon them known patterns of human behavior. 2 years earlier, she had averted a friendly fire attack when she realized that the 4 targets on an Afghanistan hillside thought to be insurgents were doing press-ups. She had never seen the Taliban working out, and assumed, rightly, that they were US soldiers. The shapes in front of her now, clustered together inside a hut on a mountainside in North Waziristan, were not normal, even allowing for the local atmospheric conditions, which were making the images less clear than she would have liked. She isolated the feed from the thermal infrared camera, which detected heat emitted from objects, and then fused it again with the image-intensified images. She had seen Taliban leaders talking many times before, and they had never stood so close. When they sat, they formed circles. These people had created something else, a glowing crucifix, to warn off the Reaper. Chapter 8. Marchant pulled off the dusty track and parked the BMW behind a cluster of coarse bushes out of sight. It was almost dark, and he could see the headlights of a lorry coming down over the Tizian Test Pass in the far distance. He wished he had been able to steal a scrambler rather than a tourer, as the BMW had struggled with the rough terrain. They had left the main road and followed an increasingly remote and bumpy track for the past half hour, Marchant keeping at least a mile between them. The man he was pursuing had stopped here a few minutes earlier and parked his bike on the other side of the track, without bothering to hide it. He was in a hurry, and had already disappeared on foot, following a steep path that zigzagged up through the wind-blown juniper-berry trees that clung to the hillside. Marchant set off up the path, confident that he had left enough time between them not to be seen. He thought he was fit from his running and his abstemious life in Marrakech, but the mountains were soon sucking the thin air from his lungs. Occasionally, as he crested another false ridge, he saw his man in front of him, at least 500 yards ahead, covering the ground with the ease of a mountain goat. Whenever he turned, Marchant pressed himself flat against the dry earth, feeling his chest rise and fall as he tried to keep his breathing quiet. It was after 40 minutes of climbing that he heard the first cries on the wind. The mountains around here were farmed by Berber goat herds, who called out to each other across the valleys as they followed their animals. Sometimes they sang bitter songs about arrogant Berbers who had travelled abroad and returned with enough money to build ugly modern houses on the hillside. But tonight, They seemed to be singing of something else. Marchant struggled with the dialect, but he could pick up enough to detect the agitation and fear in their voices. Had this man come up here to give his coded message to the goatherds, who would pass it on from man to man across the mountains, until eventually it reached Dhar? It would be in keeping with the primitive means of communication used so far. Marchant listened again to the Berber's agitated calls as a goat stumbled out of the gloaming next to him and moved off down the hillside. Something had disturbed the peace of the mountains. The man he had been following had stopped now. His hands were cupped around his mouth, and he was calling out into the dying light. The wind was in the wrong direction for Marchant to hear, but the man's body language said enough. He had sunk to his knees with exhaustion. Had he come with a warning? Was it that he was too late? Then he heard him cry out again. The swirling wind carried the sound down the hillside to Marchant. There was panic in his voice, and they weren't Berber words this time. "Yestrelai!" he shouted. "Yestrelai!" Moments later, a short burst of automatic gunfire rang out, echoing through the mountains, and the man slumped over. Marchant pressed himself closer to the earth, breathing hard, searching around for better cover, calculating where the shots had come from. He slid across to a bush, keeping his eyes on the horizon, and then he saw it, hovering up over the crest of the hill. The rock bird rose into the sky. He knew at once that it was Russian-built, an Mi-8, its distinctive profile silhouetted in the dusk light. It was white, but there were no UN markings. The shots had come from the machine gun mounted beneath the cockpit. Marchant was dead if the pilot had seen him, but the helicopter turned, nose down, and rose into the star-studded sky, heading towards the Algerian border. Chapter 9. The doubt that had been sown in the young sensor operator's mind grew stronger with every passing second. She had tried to tell herself that she was just seeing things, that she was suffering from exhaustion, too many late nights reading God's word, but there was no escaping the yellow shape that the heat of the bodies had formed. Although the hut only had a canvas roof of some kind, it was impossible to tell precisely how many people there were inside, as the bodies were bunched so closely together. Too close for Taliban. "Sir, there's something abnormal about the target imagery," she said, turning to her pilot. "Would you care to elaborate?" Spyro said, before the pilot had time to reply. The analyst paused, struggling to conceal her dislike of Spyro. "They're too close together." "Perhaps they're praying. What's the local time, anyhow? I'll put money on it being the Mecca hour. If we have no other objections, I say we shoot." Spyro directed his last comment at the base commander, who was on the phone to the Pentagon. Spyro knew the commander needed the break just as much as he did. "We're green-lit," the commander said, replacing the phone. Spyro could tell he was concealing his excitement. He just had to make sure the USAF didn't get to take any credit. "Then let's engage, people," Spyro said, putting a hand on the pilot's shoulder. The pilot flinched, and Spyro withdrew it. He knew at once that it had been an inappropriate gesture. These pilots were under pressure, too. There was talk on the base of combat stress, despite their distance from the battlefield. Unlike a fighter pilot who pulled away from the target after dropping his payload, the Reaper pilots stayed on site, watching the bloody aftermath in high magnification. "Sir, given the subject is static, I'd appreciate a second opinion," the pilot said, catching his colleague's eye. "If she's not happy, neither am I." "Are you not happy?" Spyro asked the analyst. No one in the room missed his sarcasm. "The Pentagon's happy, I'm happy, your commander here is goddamn cock-a-hoop. Salim Dhar, the world's most wanted terrorist, just spoke on a cell from the target zone, and you're not happy.
As far as we know, nobody has gone in or out of that lousy shack apart from a pack of crazy Afghani dogs. This is pay time, honey, and we'll all get a share. Don't you worry your tight little ass. I'll see to it personally."
As Spiro's words hung in the air, a phone began to ring. The commander picked it up and listened for a few moments, nodding at the pilot. "Could you stream it through now? I'd appreciate that. Channel 9. The pilot leaned forward and flicked a switch. Moments later, Salim Dhar's voice filled the stuffy room. It was only a few words, a short burst from someone who seemed to know the risk he was running by speaking on a cell phone. But no one was in any doubt. They had all heard his voice too many times in the last year, seen his face on too many posters. "Fort Meade picked it up a few seconds ago," the commander said. "Same coordinates, same cell. 100% voice print match. Confidence threshold now at 95%. Gentlemen, ladies, I hope 432 Air Expeditionary Wing will be remembered for many things, but as of this moment, will be known forever as the people who took down Salim Dhar. Engage the target." Lieutenant Oakes spent the last minutes of his life in frustration as much as fear. He had managed to corral everyone into the middle of the hut, including Murray, and persuaded them of the merits of his plan. The cross was as good as he could make it in the circumstances. 4 men lying in a line, hands still tied behind their backs, heads below the next man's shackled ankles, and then 2 lying perpendicular to them, one either side of Oakes, who was second in the upright. Even if it didn't show up as a cross, Oakes figured it would look pretty damn weird on a thermal imaging screen. But then, as they lay there, each praying to his own god, Salim Dhar was suddenly amongst them for a second time. It was only a few words, spoken on his cell phone, but it was enough to make Oakes realize what was happening. When he heard him, he screamed, hoping his voice would be picked up by someone at Fort Meade, but he was too late. Dhar had stopped talking by the time he was railing at the sky. He started to sob now, lying in the mud on his imaginary cross, the smell of urine filling the air. There was nothing left to do. For a moment he stopped, trying to hear the sound of the drone above the murmurings of his colleagues. A Reaper's turboprop engine at altitude purred like a buzzing insect. That's what they said, wasn't it? But he heard nothing. Just the noise of the dogs, which whined and ran in all directions, when the first hellfire exploded deep in the Afghan mud beside him. Chapter 10. Marchant had to call London, tell them what he'd seen, but his mobile phone had no signal. Satisfied that the helicopter had been operating on its own, he broke cover and ran back down the path to the motorbike, stumbling and falling as he went. The mountains were quiet now, the Berber goat herds stunned into silence by whatever had just happened. He started up the engine and headed back down the track to the main road and on towards Marrakech. He couldn't decide if it was safer to dump the bike and get back to his apartment before he called Fielding, or to ring as soon as he was in range. His mobile phone was encrypted, but the events he had just witnessed made him nervous of talking in the open. The sight of the man being shot had heightened his senses, stirred a primitive survival instinct. He also felt an irrational sense of loss. He had never met the man, but they had been joined in some way, had listened to the same story in the square, ridden the same route out of town, first on mobilettes, then on more powerful machines. It could have been him in the line of fire. All he wanted to do now was to get as far away as possible from the mountains, and the haunting Berber goat herds' calls that had warned of danger. It was as he throttled back the engine that he began to rethink his plans. A line of single headlights had appeared 1,000 yards ahead, coming up the straight road towards him, fanned across both lanes. He knew at once that it was the group of British bikers, one of whose machines he had stolen. Should he stop, try to explain? They had clearly seen him at the petrol station and would immediately identify the bike as theirs. It was out of the question. He could never play his employer's card. It was a last resort, reserved for tight spots with foreign governments. He would have been allowed to tell his immediate family who he worked for too, except that he didn't have any, not anymore. Not unless he counted Dhar. His priority was to get a message to Fielding. Tell him he had been right, that someone had taken Dhar away by helicopter. He was convinced that the halakha had relayed a message to Dhar, tried to warn him of a rock bird rising into the sky. It would explain the recent increased level of chatter about Dhar in the souks. But had time run out? Had the warning come too late? There was only one option. It had been a few years since he had ridden a motorbike at speed, but he had felt comfortable on the journey out of Marrakech. In his first months at Legoland in Vauxhall, working as a junior reports officer, a few of the new recruits used to take bikes out for test rides at lunchtime. There was a motorcycle dealer opposite the main entrance to Legoland, and the staff there were always obliging, one eye on a government contract, perhaps, without ever acknowledging which building Marchant and his colleagues left and entered each day. Marchant would sometimes play it up, hinting that he lived life in the international fast lane, when the truth of his head office existence was much more mundane. That was one of the reasons he wanted to stay in Morocco. He watched the needle move across the dial and adjusted his position in the saddle, wishing he was wearing a helmet. If he approached the bikers fast enough, he reckoned they wouldn't hold the line. 500 yards from them, he turned off his headlight and took the machine up to 90 miles per hour, riding in the darkness, his face cooling in the night wind. Not for the first time in his life, he felt liberated rather than scared as death drew near, sensing, as he had done before in such moments, that he was closer to those he had lost, his father, his brother. Still, the bikers were fanned across the road, no gaps between them. An image of the London Marathon came and went, the police roadblock, trying to find a way through. Then, as the needle nudged past 100, a gap started to appear at one end of the line, in the opposite lane. He headed for it, feeling the surface change beneath him as he crossed the middle of the road. For a moment he thought he had lost control, but the BMW handled well, and he accelerated again, touching 110 miles per hour. 50 yards from the line, all the bikes began to peel away, and then he was through them, the sound of their anger fading in his ears. He liked the bike, but he didn't want to steal it. Turning the headlight back on, he glanced in the mirror and saw that no one had decided to give chase. A madman had clearly stolen their bike, and he would be dead quicker than they could catch him. When he looked again, he saw the oncoming lorry's headlights, but there was no time to think. Instinctively he swerved inside the vehicle and was almost thrown by the draft as it passed him, horn blaring in the darkness. He moved back onto the correct side of the road. The petrol station where he had picked up the bike was shut, but he parked it there, flashing the headlight on and off once. A mile back up the road, one of the bikers broke away